Okay, this is video 6. I've just recorded this and I didn't send the fucking sound through the Zoom. So it's pointless me posting the last video because you can't quite hear stuff and it's important that you hear it. So this video, we're going to talk about VSTs and how you can kind of create the control of all a VST is. It's a virtual instrument which any VST like Massive, Serum, M1s, they have certain parameters on there which enable you to fuck with the sound. So I'm going to show you how you can mess with the sounds from the instruments in Ableton, or at least give yourself a little bit more control over the parameters by using an audio effects rack. And then we're going to look at some cool way in which we can introduce new sounds into a break by chopping it up within the simpler or within the sampler by the loop function. So I'm just going to quickly drag on an E piano here. This can go on this MIDI track. It's run through a simpler. It's an E piano. And if I press, you'll see what's happening is the wave file's coming along. It's just getting here. It's looping because it's looped and it loops round. You'll hear that it's filtered a little bit, and all that is they messed around with this parameter here, put the filter up, and they've turned the filter up here and rises a little bit. Now, if you're going to create a pattern, it sounds quite flat. And if you want to mess with the parameters of this, you want to add like a reverb on, you want to add delay on, you want to add the saturator on, you'll probably just end up dragging them across. Now, the problem with that is you can't really control the volumes of each one. You can through the wet and dry, but you might want the wet high. So the best way to do this is to go into your audio effects rack here in your audio effects, drag an audio effects rack on. Let's say, for example, we want a reverb. You'll come over to a reverb, you'll drag a reverb in here. You'll see the reverb. Click this little middle button there. It opens up a chain. Duplicate the chain. So you see there's two reverbs on. Go to the first one. Cut the reverb off. Now what that is, that's your dry signal coming through. So your dry signal's coming through 100%. 0 dB will be 100%. And your reverb's coming through 100%. So if I press the button now, you'll hear it's fully reverb. And if I change the parameters here, now, you might not want all of that signal coming through the original sound, so you can simply just turn it down. So you can have a subtle amount of a fully wet reverb with a longer delay. You can then come along and drag a saturator on, for example. Let me just rename these. So rename dry, Control and R, rename rev. Control, and let's put a fucking saturator on, shall we? I was going to put one of them on. You can just drag it in. Let's rename that saturator. Let's drag a delay on. I'm not going to mess with the parameters too much on all of these. I'm just dragging simple bits over just to show you. So, and then we'll rename that delay. Now, if I press it, you'll see that these two are fully, the volume's fully up. So it's going to sound louder and the delay is going to be. As I've said, you might not want the saturator to be fully saturated if you had it on soft sign or whatever you wanted to put it on. So you can turn that down. Same with the delay. You can make the delay over 4. You can make it completely wet. Like your mom. I'm only joking. Turn this down. Or turn it up, depending on how much delay you want coming through. And then what you have is you have full control of all of these parameters, all of these parameters, all of these parameters within there. And you can automate those bits on there. So it almost turns this simpler into, I mean, I'm saying this loosely, kind of into, it gives you the control of what a VST would, because you're adding your own, and you can add unlimited layers on there. Now that sounds like that now. If I turn it off, quite dry. Let's turn it off. So use your audio effects rack rather than dragging everything on. If you want to just manipulate the sound, you can then add, things on top of that if you want, and increase the chain along this way. But that's why an audio effects rack's pretty cool. Let's delete that anyway. When you looked at that audio effects, when you dragged that in, you effectively had a simpler with a audio file in there and that audio file was looped around. So what I've done is I've gone over to the samples folder somewhere and I've found a sample. Let's see if it's still highlighted. Probably not, because, oh, there it is. So I dragged this into a simpler. Bearing in mind, I've just fucking gone through all of this. Now I'm doing it again. I drag this onto a simpler. Now, if you drag it onto a simpler, you end up with just the simple. Just arm it. I can't remember the notes. I've just recorded something that sounds something like this. And then I've come over here and I've drawn it in. I've left this dry on purpose because we've got the same one. So I've just duplicated it. And then we're going to start fucking with this to use the loop function within the simpler, which is here. You can just click this loop button, but I'll show you in a second, to introduce the sound in a breakdown. So if you were watching yesterday, we had the breakdown and the breakdown technically finishes there. But remember, I put the fade to grey knob just to here before we had a fucking shootout bit just at the end. So for the purposes of this, just to show the transition, I'm going to finish the break there and just roll it back through to this. So on this simpler, which is exactly the same as the one below, what I've done is I've clicked the loop and I have literally just fucked around with these parameters here in terms of the loop length. So let me just open this up. So if the loop's 100% and the length is there, that's the same as what we've got underneath. But that's not what we want. So if I show you this, if I just move myself out of the way, and I arm this and I press solo it, there it is. So what I can do is I can increase the fade, and the fade will create this little triangle. And if I press and hold it, look, it loops. So we can move that across. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce the sound slowly like this. So that's going to roll in the break. It's going to wobble the sound up and then drop back into the actual riff itself. So it's really, really easy to do that. You can just come over to your loop length. We can set it small. You can use this length to decide where you want to start. We could start there if we want. Audition it. And then open it up. So to open it up, we'll click this and you can see that we come over to this automation chain here, this automation lane there. We're just going to drag this, we're going to bring it up. And we're going to see what happens. We'll open up fully. Now the timing here is up to you. You might have to fuck around a little bit to make it sound okay, but let's just audition that and see how it goes. Right, give me 1 minute. If I can just minimize this, something's in the way. You bastard. There we go, it's gone. Hang on a second. See this here? If you've done automation, which I've already just done, and then you start messing around with the automation channels again without redrawing over it, this box will highlight. So click that and it'll reset it. So let's listen. That's the purpose. So what it's done is it's taken the same loop, and bearing in mind there's nothing on there. We could put EQ, we can put a audio effects rack on there and make it sound better. But it's chopped it slowly and we've automated it slowly to rise within the break, to introduce the sound and then drop here. So if you're doing this with a simpler is good if your sample is in C only, because simpler can't tell the difference between A, F, C, and whatever the root note. But you can do the same in sampler. I'll show you the sampler in a second, how to do that. Sampler is actually a little bit better for this than simpler. The reason I showed you simpler first is because when I dragged that instrument in, which was the E-piano from a simpler preset in Ableton, it was in there. So let's just listen to how this sounds. I'll turn the bass off because I don't think the bass works with this riff, but let's just have a look.
Rich, this is lot of fucking nonsense to around. Fucking nonsense. Get out your fucking life. Go on, get out. Go on, fuck off. Call yourself a fucking gangster.
So yeah, that's how you can introduce a sound and make it sound a little bit interesting. You can make it sound much more interesting than this because you can play with all these parameters in there and just automating whatever you like to introduce that next sound after the breakdown into your next drop. So to show you in sampler quickly, if I just insert a MIDI track, and we're going to go to sampler, where are we? And sampler, genuinely, I'd probably use sampler because you might not be using a hit or a synth hit that's in, you might find a hit that's in A, but your track's in E and you want to put it into E. So what you'd do is you'd come over, you'd take the same hit, you'd drag it on, and you'd then change that to whatever the root note is of your sample. I mean, this is in C, so if it's ever in C, you don't have to change it. Just bear that in mind. So let's just arm this track a second. And if we press, it's the same shit. So you come over here to sustain mode, and then you can move your loop across like this. You can also move the start across and your loop end. So we listen to this, and then we can just pull this down, so you can automate this down. Bang. So you could draw a MIDI file in there like this, hold E, for example, pull this across. That's the same thing. You can come back over here. You can then, where were we? It was the loop length. You can start your loop wherever you want. If I set this there, and you can basically do the same shit there, just roll it back, just put your automation on. But that's it for now. Just a nice short video. It's a shame, pain in the arse. I've had to do this twice. I think the first video was probably better, but who gives a shit? If you've got any questions, just give me a shout. Nice one. And there's really one important thing I forgot to mention. I was rushing the last video. So when I was just showing you guys how to do the sampler where you can go and automate the loop length here, sampler's a little bit different. You can fuck around with it here, and you can record it into audio. So if I just show you, loop end, for example. So you could, if you really want to, probably don't recommend this way, but insert an audio track here underneath, and then come across to your extension in, and then record it in. So feed this channel into that. So you'd feed channel 15 in, and then record it to audio as you manually fuck about with this. But a much easier way than doing that, because when you notice here, if I click on, let me stop it a second. If I click on this, there's no automation. It doesn't change the automation here. So to get around that, what we have to do is you have to go and create a mod wheel. So go over to your MIDI section there, go to your mod wheel, click here, go to loop length. You can set that minus 100% or plus 100%. It's entirely up to you. Make sure it's on. And then what you do is if you go into the clip itself, and you come here, you don't click on the sampler itself, you click on your MIDI controller, and you select your modulation wheel. And what that'll do is, if you listen to this, automate this bit. So if you was going to automate it from choppy, find where it's first choppy. So you can have it there and sort of going like this, from there up like this, for example. Maybe like this. See how it sounds?
Get your fucking life. Go get out. Go and fuck off. Call yourself a fucking gangster. Fucking through. Look, this is not fucking nonsense to allow. Fucking nonsense. Get your fucking life. Go get out. Go and fuck off.
Where you set the timings up to you. That sounded a bit shit, but you can put an auto filter on it, for example. But it's just trial and error.
Look, this is not fucking nonsense to allow. Fucking nonsense. Get your fucking life. Go get out. Go and fuck off.
So yeah, it has to be done for a mod wheel in sampler rather than doing it that way, and you can just change the start.
Look, this is not
it doesn't start position.
Fucking nonsense. Get your fucking life. Go get out. Go and fuck off. Call yourself a fucking gangster.
Just remember that.